Hi everyone, I'm Gary Null. Nice to have you with us today. We're going to be exploring several issues in depth, and just an upcoming announcement that I'm going to try something a little different. One day a week, probably Fridays, I'll be setting aside the full program to do a classroom on the air concerning health. I used to do this a lot. I ended up doing it on Sunday nights with Dr. Martin Feldman for over 40 years. And so just for those of you who would like more in-depth on topics involving our health and longevity, that'll be starting this Friday. But today, we're going to give you the latest on health. University Hospital Würzburg in Germany, they looked at the clinical significance of micronutrients. Those are small amounts in critically ill COVID-19 patients with severe ARDS. And what they found was, yes, you need these. Now, which ones have we been telling you about? Zinc, yep, that's there. And selenium, the two most important micronutrients. Now, vitamin D3 is not a micronutrient. Magnesium is a macronutrient. But for those of you who have been taking your micronutrients every day in a multiple vitamin or individually, 200 micrograms of selenium would do fine, and also 30 to 50 milligrams of zinc would be particularly good for you as well. We have a lot to talk about. In fact, if you want to help yourself with insomnia, there's a juice to take, according to Louisiana State University, and I'll be giving you that. But also today, to the person who sent me over a clip of Tucker Carlson, thank you. Last night at about 41 minutes into the program, Tucker had a person on who is an environmentalist, who's an author of a new book. I haven't read the book, didn't know about it, and saying that what we're really seeing is not human-caused environmental degradation. And these are natural cycles, and there's really nothing that unusual about what we're experiencing now. And Tucker agreed with him. And this is where there are several issues. Tucker and I share substantially different points of view. And this is one. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask people in the audience to please send this segment my commentary in response to the gentleman last night that, yes, indeed, it is our cause and effect that is fueling a lot of what we're seeing, not everything. And there are people who've made statements that, in retrospect, I said at the time, can you prove what you're about to say is going to happen in 5 or 10 years? And they were absolutely certain of it, but of course it didn't happen. That just makes them look foolish and irresponsible. But what I said to them was, why don't you pull back and try to look at what's happening in different parts, the most vulnerable parts of our world? And then I predicted that there would be originally 12, then it went up to 20, now it's up to 42 tipping points and negative feedback loops. I'll explain all that. And those absolutely can be connected to human activity. So I believe it's important that we take responsibility for what we are doing now, even innocently so, versus just simply saying, well, it has nothing to do with us. We don't have to change our lifestyle or our buying habits. Yes, we do. Also today, we're going to hear what I didn't have a chance yesterday to do, Bill Maher, about looking at water and the drought in California. He makes a few interesting points. Also, I'm putting more videos on of disempowered parents who have been swept aside in what goes into curriculums in schools, what the local school boards are allowing the children to learn, without considering what it means to be a parent and realize the system has more power over what goes into your child's mind than you do, if you allow it. So there are people finally saying, I've had enough. I'm going to go to the school board and I'm going to tell them what I think. You're going to hear from an African-American father giving his opinion, may not be yours, maybe yours. And I always hold this. that we should never be afraid of open, honest challenge and debate on any topic, especially when it comes to social values, family values, cultural values, historical values, and our right to dissent, our right to give our points of view. I do not support in any form censorship. And right now, censorship is the heart and soul of the cancel culture and identity politics. So we hear what he has to say. Now also, I believe that within the next 3 months, there will be a public disclosure of what was really behind the Wuhan lab leak. And if all goes well, in 14 days from now, that's the date I've been given, we'll have someone on the program who will probably give us the most important information. We know what it is, I know what it is, but I'm having outside MD PhDs review it for accuracy. It'll make news, at least to those who are looking for the truth. But I believe that we're going to see this picture's a lot darker, and people were far more complicit than the media who's been protecting the Bill Gates, Anthony Fauci, and Peter Daszak have acknowledged. So we're going to hear from a Dr. McCullough, very short. Listen to what he has to say. It's only 60 seconds. And he is one of the most outstanding MD, PhD, scientists, clinicians, published authors. He's the world's leader in publishing on PubMed, over 1,000 articles, and one of the most cited doctors in the world. He's not a conspiracy theorist. You'll hear that today as well. So as you see, we have a lot to share, and I have a lot more on different topics I'm going to bring you, but we always begin with the latest on health and healing. So now we know that in an abstract from a scientific study, there was an interplay between inflammation and oxidative stress, and it's a vicious cycle and potentially resulting in organ damage. Essential micronutrients like selenium, and on the periodic chart is SEN, zinc, ZN, support anti-oxidative defense systems and are commonly depleted in severe disease. So when you start looking at people who are suffering from COVID, if they're older, you're looking at people almost always are vitamin deficient. So you've got to have in every hospital zinc, magnesium, vitamin D, vitamin C, quercetin, ivermectin, and hydroxychloroquine. That would be an absolute essential kit to save lives. And it's no longer speculative. I just reported on 3 studies yesterday, brand new. That case has been served up. We've been lied to and manipulated. More on that. But what about people who are at home? Wouldn't it make sense to be using these nutrients every day? You bet it would be. Get your 200 micrograms mcg of selenium, and, well, let's go on the conservative side. 25 to 50 milligrams of zinc each day. 2,000 milligrams of vitamin C a day in divided doses throughout the day. 5,000 units of vitamin D, and 1,000 milligrams of magnesium in divided doses, 500 and 500. And then put half a teaspoon of Manuka honey in, and have that into a green tea. That'll make a big difference in your health. From Louisiana State University, they took a look at tart cherry, that's your Montmorency cherry, for treatment of insomnia. And how does it work, if it does work? Now, we know that insomnia is very common in college students, high school students, and of course the elderly or those who are stressed. And it can end up becoming a chronic disorder. And we've seen that Montmorency, Montmorency, Montmorency tart cherry juice, you can get it anywhere, has improved insomnia. And so they want to know why. And so they took the people's blood they examined for tryptophan, they examined for other conditions, and they found that, well, in this randomized, placebo-controlled 2-week study, that those who took the tart cherry juice had really much better sleep outcomes. Quote, results, 11 subjects were randomized, and they had sleep apnea, and they were excluded, and they took a look and they found that it induces deep sleep, greater sleep efficacy. And why? And that's because of procyanidins, B2 inhibit IDO. It increases tryptophan availability, reduces inflammation, and it also is a stimulator of melatonin. So, if you're having trouble sleeping, take maybe 1 to 3 milligrams of melatonin a couple hours before, but also take a tablespoon of tart cherry juice. And we just are finding out from Cincinnati Children's Hospital, those who have chronic migraine headaches should look at whether or not they're deficient in vitamin D3, riboflavin, and coenzyme Q10. And normally, when people have a deficiency of these 3 nutrients, they end up with migraines. So, if you're a migraine sufferer, D3, riboflavin, and coenzyme Q10. That'll help. That was published in this meeting of the annual meeting of American Headache Society. Research suggests mask wearing can increase struggles with social anxiety. University of Waterloo, which is in Canada. So people who struggle with social anxiety might experience increased distress related to mask wearing during and even after the COVID pandemic. So that was published by the Department of Psychology and the Center for Mental Health Research. But a separate study, in my opinion far more worrisome, showed that when they examined masks that children regularly wear, over 80% were contaminated with very serious germs that could really hurt the children. That's brand new. That was just out yesterday. But nobody was paying attention to how often a child wears a mask and all the different contaminants that a child's going to put on the mask, outside, inside, handling it, how the little fibers come off. That's a separate study where the fiber material in these masks can end up getting into your lungs, and those are not easily dispelled from the lungs, and that can cause lung conditions, lung disease. So I think it's important that you take a more honest look at the fact that these masks are not being used properly, and they're not being discarded frequently. They're being overused, and they're functionally useless. The science does not support all the claims made for them. University of London, going with your gut, that's your intuition, can result in better decision-making than using detailed data methods. Managers who use their gut instinct, together with simple decision-making strategies, may make equally good but faster decisions as those who use data to research an outcome. So, we have intuition for a reason, and how many times has your gut told you what to do, and you did it, and it was right, or you didn't do it, and you should have? Just a simple piece of research. For those of you who have memory deficits and have Parkinson's, from Damhang University in Iran comes a study about rosemary extract can make a difference. Very simple, just rosemary extract. And from Johns Hopkins University, inadequate vitamin D level associated with interstitial lung disease, published in Journal of Nutrition. So why not just get more vitamin D into your body every day? And the sun alone, if you're putting on a lot of sunscreen, will not do the job. I just believe that we should be supplementing with larger amounts than I previously advised, because of how powerful it is in protecting our lungs and body and our immune system. Some other news before we take a break that's important. This is from the Daily Exposé, evidence of antibody-dependent enhancement. Where'd you hear that? How about 5 months ago here on this program, we said it could be one of the side effects of the vaccinating a person, and what is called the antibody-dependent enhancement could be extremely dangerous for people who already have some form of autoimmune condition, which is about 1/3 of all the people living in America. But nobody cared. Nobody paid attention. They just rolled up their sleeves and did what they were told to do, get vaccinated. Here's the latest quote. We are beginning to see evidence of antibody-dependent enhancement due to COVID vaccines in the United Kingdom. The latest data on hospitalizations and deaths allegedly due to COVID-19 certainly suggests so. ADE is antibody-dependent enhancement, can arise in several different ways, but the best known is dubbed the Trojan horse pathway. This occurs when non-neutralizing antibodies generated by past infection or vaccination fail to shut down the pathogen upon re-exposure. Instead, they act as a gateway for allowing the virus to gain entry and replicate in cells that are usually off-limits, typically your immune cells, like macrophages. That in turn can lead to wider dissemination of illness and overreactive immune responses that cause more severe illness. Dr. Barry Bloom, MD, PhD of the Harvard Chan School of Public Health, explanation of ADD is as follows, quote, the cause of ADE is having antibodies to a virus that don't neutralize it. That enables the virus to be gobbled up by cells that have receptors for antibodies, but not the virus. That's the way of getting the virus into cells that it ordinarily would not infect, end quote. So, we were told this wouldn't happen. They were wrong. We told you it could happen. We were right. Just letting you know. This is an interesting study. This is from the journal Cancer Discovery, a very important, highly respected journal, an article by Philip Schneider. Quote, long-term mask use may contribute to advanced stage lung cancer. Let me repeat that. Long-term mask use may contribute to advanced stage lung cancer. Quote, a recent study in the journal Cancer Discovery found that inhalation of harmful microbes can contribute to advanced stage lung cancer in adults. Long-term use of face masks may help breed these dangerous pathogens. Microbiologists agree that frequent mask wearing creates a moist environment in which microbes are allowed to grow and proliferate before entering the lungs. Those formed microbes then travel down the trachea and into two tubes called the bronchi until they reach small air sacs covered in blood vessels called the alveoli. Quote, the lungs were long thought to be sterile, but we now know that oral contaminants, microbes, normally found in the mouth frequently enter the lungs due to unconscious aspirations, end quote. That was the study's lead author and director of the Lung Microbiome Program, Associate Professor of Medicine at New York University, Grossman School of Medicine. So, once again, go back and listen to what we were warning. I was giving you OSHA studies on how lung disease occurs from wearing masks and how the fibers break off. That was 9 months ago. Once again, Anthony Fauci was wrong. We were right. How many people have developed cancer because of that? Here's something else from Jackie Salo. Hundreds of vaccinated Indonesian healthcare workers get COVID-19. Quote, more than 350 healthcare workers have become infected with COVID-19 in Indonesia and dozens hospitalized despite being vaccinated. All right. But hold on, weren't we told, wasn't there a convincing campaign, get the vaccine and not get COVID? Well, they lied. Now to something that is important also, and that's the environment. This is from The Guardian, from today. Potentially the worst drought in 1,200 years. Scientists on the scorching U.S. heat wave Researchers had long forewarned of this crisis, and now they're seeing their studies and models become real life. The heat wave gripping the United States West is simultaneously breaking hundreds of temperature records, exacerbating a historic drought, and priming the landscape for a summer and fall of extreme wildfire. Salt Lake City hit a record-breaking 107 degrees Fahrenheit. By the way, that would be 42 degrees Celsius. While in Texas and California, power grid operators are asking residents to conserve energy to avoid rolling blackouts and outages. And all this before we've even reached the hottest part of the summer. Among the 40 million Americans enduring the triple-digit temperatures are scientists who study droughts and the climate. They had long forewarned of this crisis, and now they're living through it. The Guardian spoke with researchers across the West about how they're coping. Paleontologists, quote, potentially the worst drought in 1,200 years. Then it goes into it. Let's go back 12 years. 12 years ago, I began a study on an in-depth study with a lot of scholarship, thousands of hours spent interviewing climatologists and researching all the critical literature. And the planet does not collapse all at once. No society does. We break apart piece by piece, much like an iceberg. It was once an ice pack on a glacier until it moved slowly until it calved and broke into the ocean. In and of itself, that doesn't end the world. What happens is that when enough people don't change the way they're doing something, that something becomes a trigger point to where you keep creating more carbon dioxide. And that in turn creates heat in the environment, and then methane gases creates far more heat. And when both are happening simultaneously because of excessive heat, then you have to ask, where's all this heat coming from? We're going to go now, and I'm going to answer that in a commentary, but we're going to go to a clip last night from Tucker Carlson, and this is where Tucker and I are completely at different perspectives. But my hope is this. Tucker keeps saying that he's open to proof of things. Good. Then this afternoon, my office is sending Tucker a copy of 3 films. One is the most winning film, a documentary in history of all documentaries ever produced. You wouldn't know that by Wikipedia or anywhere else, but we actually have posted all those awards up on GaryNull.com so you can see for yourself. Over 230 awards as of today, very prestigious ones. And yet I'm going to premiere it, and we're just finalizing the theater so you can see it for yourself. It's possibly the most powerful film ever done on the environment. And it's honest. And it is scary. But there's 2 other films, Saving the Planet One Bite at a Time, and the book, the 700-page book, all documented with thousands of scientific references, proving the human intervention is what has caused this, contributed to it. And then one other one that we're going to send all those over to him. But send him the segment we're about to play. Let's play the short clip. This is only a part of an interview with a person who has a new book out. I don't know the gentleman. And this is what he has to say about we are not responsible for global warming.
So it turns out we're not all going to be dead as a species in a dozen years. That's the word from Steve Koonin. He was one of the climate scientists who looked into this in the Obama administration. He spent many years looking into it, in fact. He's not a conservative, but he's an honest man. And he has found that much of the data that we are fed as if it is science is, in fact, manipulated and or false. We had an amazing conversation with Steve Koonin in the latest episode of Tucker Carlson Today. Here's part of it.
The idea that human behavior is causing more extreme weather, droughts, hurricanes. You're smiling.
It's a fiction of the media and the politicians who would like to promote that notion. When you look at the actual data, and what I've written in the book is a summary of the data and the official science as written by the IPC, the UN, and the US government, there are no detectable human influences on hurricanes over almost a century. The heat waves in the US are no more common today than they were in 1900, and the warmest temperatures have not gone up in the last 60 years. Sea level is rising at the grand rate of 1 foot a century. We can go into the details of that, but it was rising the same if you go back 60 years ago. So there's a lot of natural variability in the system, and it's very difficult to untangle or discern human effects in extreme weather. When I hear people talking about these existential threats, I'm reminded of the line from the Princess Bride movie, where Vizzini keeps using the word inconceivable. And Inigo Montoya says to him, "You keep using that word. I don't think it means what you think it means. And I don't think the science says what Mayor Pete, or now Secretary Pete, thinks it says. In fact, I can guarantee you he's never read the science. In fact, I can guarantee you that Senator Saunders, President Biden, Ambassador Kerry, Secretary Granholm have never read the science, because you need to be a scientist in order to do that. All right? And in fact, when you read it, there's very little in terms of extreme weather that's changed over the last many decades.
But that claim is ubiquitous.
Of course it is. Okay?
Why is that?
That's part of the corruption of climate communications that's taken place as you go from the literature to the UN and US government reports to the summaries of those reports to, if you'll excuse me, the media and the politicians.
So that is just...
Okay, that's his opinion, and Tucker supports it. My hope is that someone will send this segment to Tucker. Tucker, if you are as open as you claim to be, please consider the following. I'm going to quote now from The Guardian, from Daniel Swain, climate scientist, Institute of Environmental and Sustainability, University of California, Los Angeles. Quote, "This is really, really bad. Here on the eastern side of the Rockies, here in Boulder, we're seeing record high temperatures. That's the case in other parts of the state and in other states. And we're seeing smoke plumes, not from local fires, but from fires in Arizona and Utah. I think for a lot of people, it's traumatic. The fires we saw in the last couple of years were really awful. And this year, it seems like we're on that same trajectory. It kind of feels like deja vu. It does get rough sometimes, talking about these things year after year. I live in the West, and all my family pretty much lives in the West. Most of my friends live in the West. It's where I grew up, and seeing the landscape scale transformation that is happening here and seeing how it's affecting people is overwhelming sometimes. But actually, to me, the most distressing part is that this is very much in line with predictions. Climate scientists have been repeating essentially the same messages and warnings since before I was born. Climate change is a major contributor to, if not the dominant factor, in a lot of changes that we're seeing out west and elsewhere. And it just is going to keep getting worse unless we do something about it. And so far, we have yet to do the kinds of things on a large enough scale that are actually going to make a meaningful difference. Then we have Catherine Hayhoe from Texas, climate scientist and chief scientist at the Nature Conservancy. The atmospheric scientist says, quote, "It's surreal to see your models become real life. The extreme heat and wildfires aren't surprising, but it's just surreal to see what you only ever saw before in your research studies and models actually happening in real life. And you're almost dumbfounded by the speed at which your projections have become reality. Climate change is loading the weather dice against you. We always have a chance of rolling a double six naturally and getting an intense record-breaking summer heat wave, but decade after decade, as the world warms, it's as if climate change is sneaking in and taking one of those numbers on the dice and turning it into another 6, and then another 6, and maybe even a 7. So we are seeing that heat waves are coming earlier in the year, they are longer, and they're stronger. Still, the public opinion data shows that there's a disconnect, where even though about 72% of people in the U.S. say global warming is happening, only 40% say they think that it will affect them directly. but we actually did a recent study looking at climate and weather extremes, and we found that really hot, dry conditions are the only thing that most people in the United States directly connect to climate change. So right now is a really important time for scientists to communicate with the public that climate change is here and climate actions matter. And then one last one here is from Wang, Simon Wang from Utah, professor of climate dynamics at Utah State University. Yesterday, when Salt Lake City hit record temperatures, we went to one of our grad students' backyards to barbecue some burgers and do some work. But it was so hot, oh my God, 107 degrees, so hot that actually 3 out of the 5 student computers overheated and broke. I was the first to throw in the white flag and asked to go home. I'm really hurting. As a meteorologist, of course, this isn't a surprise. The warming climate is making these dry, hot periods even drier and hotter. Since we're in a drought, we don't really have much moisture in the soil. And without this moisture, the sun really heats up the ground and the air much faster. So really what we're seeing in the Southwest is the ground is burning like a hot plate and we're standing on it. But you know, I actually feel kind of optimistic. In the restaurants and beer houses right now, everybody's talking about the weather and how hot it is. And a few of them will even comment, this is the new normal. I mean, we're in Utah. Whatever people believe in, they know it's really hot and the climate is changing, and they don't like that. Okay. Now, what none of these people just said was that who's responsible? How did this happen? They're acknowledging that they have a crisis to deal with. They're just not acknowledging their responsibility. After all, it shows a real disconnect if you can say it's 107 degrees, but we're out there making hamburgers. Well, what do you think was the part that you contributed by eating the hamburgers, that you had to clear the rainforest in order to plant the genetically engineered soybeans, in order to ship that clear up to the United States where you could have your Utah hamburger in the backyard? And where is Utah on any standard of planting trees that would capture the carbon and provide more moisture into the soil, as some places in Australia are doing? Well, none of that's happening. And there's a scientist. So to suggest that this is a normal thing, this heat wave, it is not. The records show that we have had over 125,000 unique weather extremes in the last 24 months. That's never happened before. My commentary is simple. We need to realize that underlying all weather, atmospheric, and oceanic science are the fundamental basic laws of physics. These are constants. Humans have no capacity to change physical laws. We can harness those laws in order to develop technologies, but we can't change those physical laws. They are natural constants. Our lives, our societies, our technologies, our sciences are all confined to the limitations that physical law demands. We have the choice to ignore those laws or to outright deny them. Corporate America denies them. And average individuals, even professionals and well-educated people, even scientists who are supposed to know better, they're also ignoring them. But that won't change anything other than keep us imprisoned by illusions of our own making. There's a simple lesson that I've taught many times, most recently to a group that attended an anti-aging clinical study. It's about explaining the weather in a way that is karmic, and it determines whether there is a negative or positive outcome based upon our free will being expressed. Remember the film Thelma and Louise with Susan Sarandon, who was Louise, and Gina Davis, who was Thelma? In the final scene, they're being chased in their old Ford Thunderbird by squads of police cars across the landscape in the Grand Canyon. They know if caught, they'll spend the rest of their lives in prison. A couple 100 yards ahead is a cliff, and that would certainly kill them if they drove over it. So in the film, Thelma says, keep going. No way do they want to spend the remainder of their lives behind bars. They decide they would rather be dead. Louise slams on the gas and races towards the cliff to commit suicide. Now imagine a different conclusion to the film's script. At 100 yards away from the cliff, Thelma says, "You know, Louise, maybe this isn't a great idea. I'd like to be a grandmother. Maybe we can get out of jail for good behavior and we can still live freely into old age." And Louise says, "Yeah, good idea, Thelma. Let's stop and surrender." In that case, the laws of physics, of distance, velocity, the weight of the Ford, and the mechanics of the friction on the Grand Canyon surface would enable Louise to slam on the brakes in time before reaching the cliff. But if they're only 30 feet away from the cliff and Thelma says, "Louise, this ain't a great idea. Let's stop." Well, too bad. You've chosen a negative karma. You have passed beyond what the laws of physics allows, given the new conditions and limitations in place compared to being 100 yards away. You no longer have any free will or choice in the matter. You're going off the cliff whether you want to at that moment or not. So the major climate tipping points are the cliffs lying before us, and there's a lot of them. Atmospheric scientists, oceanographers, geologists have been telling us this for decades, well before there was anything called climate change denialism. We can slam on the gas and race towards them, or up to a certain point we have the choice to slam on the brakes to avoid plunging to our demise. But what scientists are now warning us more frequently is that some of these tipping points are inevitable. Nothing any of us can do will make a change on certain tipping points. We have raced past the 30-foot mark, beyond the threshold where we have any choice in the matter. How long it will take for us to reach the end of those 30 feet is still uncertain. Some say within 10 years. They said 12 years 2 years ago. Guy McPherson, others said it would be much shorter, 5 years or less. Guy was inaccurate on that. I said at the time that none of these figures are accurate because no society collapses all at once. What you have is, however, you have episodic breakdowns where the tipping point and the negative feedback loops and the outcomes will impact certain areas of the world before other areas. All areas will inevitably be affected, but not at the same time. It could be 10, 20, 30 years between the worst-case scenario happening in sub-Saharan Africa, which is happening now, with millions of people who have no food, no water, and no one inviting them in to stay in their countries. They're environmental refugees. You have a large number of people coming up from Central and South America, again, aside from the politics that have dominated that area of the world for a long time, including America's school of down in Georgia that taught assassination and destabilization and did so in those countries. Operation Condor is but one example. Beyond that, the weather is a far greater negative to those people. People have learned to adapt, unfortunately maladapt, to corrupt politics in almost every country in South and Central America and in Mexico. But you cannot adapt to not eating and not having water. Those are essentials. Facts of life. But now the soil is working against you. It's too dry. As a result, seeds are not germinating. As a result, your families are going hungry. At some point, you have no choice. You have to find a safer place for your family. That represents an unknown percentage of the people migrating to the United States. Understand something. Our predictive technologies in simulations are incapable of predicting cohesively or accurately all of the numerous physical factors now in place. So we don't even know where 30 feet from the cliff is any longer. And based upon this kind of artificial, woke, utopian way of dealing with everything, with gross immaturity, childlike behavior, tantrums, outrage, self-righteous indignation, and a complete functional illiteracy about how the world actually works, nor how people actually cohesively live together, cooperatively, these people don't care about any of this. They're not doing a thing to change it. There's no demonstrations by them to protect the world or these different places. So did you know how dry it was in Syria that led to 4 years of extreme drought, that then was used as the excuse by other governments, including the United States and France and Great Britain, to cause insurrections in Syria and blame it on Assad? No. Are you aware of how many places in the United States are no longer inhabitable for the future? It's gone. They've reached the 30-foot mark. No matter what you do in California, it's over. Utah, it's over. Colorado, it's over. Kansas, it's over. South Dakota, it's almost over. New Mexico, over. Nevada, over and dead. When everything else is gone except the insects, there'll still be Wayne Newton singing Donkey Shane. God. That's where we're at. So you can pretend and play. You can engage in all of the corrupt politics, and you can have governors who don't give a damn about you, but only themselves and their hairdo. And instead of saying, this place is gone, let's relocate people to a better habitat, and then let's create a habitat that we don't destroy by overdevelopment, by industries, and by agriculture, by draining off all the water. That would be the smart thing. But we're not known for doing the smart things, not when politics is involved, ever, and certainly never when corporate America and its greed fest is involved. Earlier this month, Potsdam Institute of Climate Research in Germany, one of the preeminent research centers in the world, warned that the tipping points could topple like dominoes. They will increasingly destabilize each other as the world continues to warm. They looked especially at the interconnections between West Antarctica, Greenland, and the warming of the Atlantic Gulf Stream and the loss of the Amazon rainforest. These are just four of the major tipping points. They are all deeply interconnected based upon physical laws. Some large Antarctic ice sheets have passed their tipping, meaning sea level rises are coming. Arctic University of Norway last month reported that faster Greenland ice melt is now unstoppable. The Potsdam study confirmed an earlier University of Exeter study that had the same conclusions and concluded that, quote, this was an essential threat to civilization, not local civilization, all civilization. Also this month, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, NOAA, and Scripps Institute of Oceanography at the University of California, San Diego, reported that atmospheric CO2 is now at the highest level in over 4 million years. Tucker, your guess was wrong on every point made. Before our human species evolved on the planet, only 300,000 or so years ago. The other tipping points that you're not being told about, you don't know anything about because you haven't found it of interest. Melting of the Arctic ice cap. This tipping point is already passed. Nothing can stop it. When that melts, then you don't have any ice for the sun to be reflected back harmlessly into the atmosphere. It's going to hit the rock, warm the rock, lower ice, later ice will all melt, and then the shallow depths of the Arctic Ocean will then heat up. Methane gas trapped there for millions of years will then be released, and that will create an inferno. Loss of glacier ice, loss of what is called the albedo, and rise in sea levels. Fresh water from Arctic and Greenland collapsing the Gulf Stream. El Nino becomes a permanent climate fixture. Disruption of the Indian and West African monsoons. Melting permafrost and tundra releases vast quantities of methane. The Clathray gun effect. Desertification, where thousands of communities and around in China, because China's done nothing to help its environment, but it's done everything to grow its economy and its influence to challenge America for the supremacy of the dollar. Everybody laughed at that idea 10 years ago, saying it represented under 1% of the trade in the dollar versus the yuan. Well, now they're not laughing, because in the next 2 years, China will absolutely pass the United States in its industrialized output. The United States gave up because of politicians accepting, unfortunately, donations from PAC groups controlled by people who wanted to offshore your jobs by closing down your factories. So we lost that, and that's not coming back. But China's building, and we're not. So now we have all of this happening. We have the desertification happening in the United States. We have the Arctic ozone hole. We have the loss of the New Guinea rainforest, aside from the Amazon. We have the loss of the boreal forest, which is a ring across the northern Canada, the Yukon, Siberia, and Russia, into the north of the Scandinavian countries, and that's a more recent tipping point added. Then there are the climate feedback loops. These are a consequence of the changes in the tipping point items and their interrelationships. Years ago, scientists only spoke about the major tipping points. Back then, there were only a small handful of feedback loops recognized as the albedo effect in the Arctic, when loss of sea ice, which reflects heat back into space, gives way to dark ocean water that absorbs heat. All the fires in California and Australia contribute to a feedback loop, since these increase atmospheric CO2, thereby warming the planet further, and as a consequence making the world more dry, thereby increasing wildfires. In other words, wildfires produce more wildfires. But there's other major feedback loops that are worrisome, and they are now experiencing their consequences. The extended droughts, as an expected outcome of global warming, can increase the intensity of heat waves. More wildfires also means more soot in the air, which further decreases the albedo of ice, snow, and glaciers. Permafrost melts, release CO2 and methane from new bacterial activity. Melting permafrost also releases oxides and nitrogen, and that increases greenhouse gases. Freely released methane from deeper reservoirs starts to release carbon net rather than absorb carbon, the sink. So all of those wonderful trees that we were clearing by the millions, or not tending to, and as a result, because of our reckless lifestyles, allowed the heat to go up. Remember, the more people living in a given area, the more CO2. The more land you clear for those developments, the more CO2. What would it protect us with having a civil conservation corps like Franklin Roosevelt had, and growing hundreds of millions of trees in each state? Well, that was never done because that wasn't sexy, and nobody agreed to it. And as a result, now all that land clearing and all that agriculture and all that waste of all that agriculture, especially growing things where they shouldn't be grown, like California and almonds, that's the dumbest thing on the planet. You can't get any stupider, except for growing cotton in Arizona, two massively water-intense products. But as long as someone's putting money in a politician's pocket, and it looks like New York, New Jersey, and California have a lot of open pockets by politicians. So then you get melting permafrost all over the planet. And also you're freely releasing methane from deeper reservoirs, and that starts to release carbon, and that's really bad. The melting of Greenland and the Antarctic ice cap is also uncovering the same methane held in deep reservoirs beneath the ice. Extreme weather feedback combos. Each extreme weather event leads to less CO2 absorption, then leads to more warming, that leads then to more extreme weather events. Larger storms from global warming cause updrafts to carry moisture all the way into the stratosphere, reducing ozone and creating more greenhouse gas water vapor into part of the atmosphere that otherwise has very little of it. Warming sea surface increases methane and bacteria that releases methane, and new flooded areas from sea level rise turn into new swamps releasing more methane over time. An atmospheric humidity increases with global warming. The amount of high troposphere ice particles increases. These ice particles reduce the rate of methane oxidation. This implies that with rising global temperatures, the global warming potential of the methane in the atmosphere over the Antarctic will increase, therefore speeding up the release of ice in the Antarctic. Rising atmospheric CO2 speeds carbon loss from forest soils, drying out forests, then making the insects a better habitat than the trees, and as a result, hundreds of millions of trees dying, and those trees then become fodder for the fires. A sudden switch from a 3-cell northern hemisphere system, which we currently have, to a 1-cell system because of the loss of temperature differential between the equator and the North Pole. 1-cell system will transport heat from the equator to the pole more efficiently. If methane reaches a large enough level in the atmosphere, its average time aloft starts to increase because of saturation point. Weakened natural ecosystems attract more pests, create disease, release methane. As beetles and other diseases move north due to its global warming, the number of sick trees increases rapidly. All up and down the East Coast, where there used to be a lot of large forest growth, for example, in Georgia, as one example, in South Carolina, those are dying now because there was no maintenance, no care for them. Weakened natural ecologies attract more pests, create more disease, and soils erode and wash away. We now have a new Dust Bowl, dwarfing the Dust Bowl in Oklahoma back in the 1930s because of poor management of the soil. Factory farming destroys soil and increases the wash-off of nitrogen and chemicals into the Mississippi and Missouri, and they all go down the Gulf of Mexico and then create these gigantic dead areas, dead zones they're called. One is larger than the state of New Jersey. All because of greed in farming and control of the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And then terrestrial soils dry up and release CO2 and methane. If the bank of carbon held in the world's soils were to drop by just 0.3%, the release would equal a year's worth of fossil fuel emissions. And that's happening. Warmer oceans absorb less CO2. Oceans that grow more acidic due to fossil fuel emissions amplify global warming by releasing less of a gas than helps shield Earth from radiation. Warmer oceans kill off phytoplankton that otherwise sequester CO2. The loss of Greenland's ice sheet, which is happening, and others, as well as shifts in drying and flooding of water on land, lead to tectonic shifts and increased eruptions of volcanoes, releasing carbon that leads to likely longer-term warming. And when we define our age as the Anthropocene, we usually think of it solely in terms of how humans are changing the environment and therefore also altering the climate. This is too limited a definition. When we add all of the many other dysfunctions in modern human civilization, artificial intelligence, our addiction to technology for the only solutions available, dysfunctional political and economic governance, medicine and healthcare that it has a 19th century level of maturity and is thoroughly reductionist, but then is combined with 21st century technology, then the Anthropocene should really refer to humanity being recklessly out of balance and out of touch with nature. It really describes our era when we no longer know how to coexist with nature, let alone with each other. So Tucker, do your own homework, buddy. Do your homework. Don't rely upon your guest to be your only probable source of insight. We are the problem. I'm Gary Null. Thank you all for listening and have a nice day.